So, thanks for all of you who are joining us online for this live session for week 3. We're here with Professor Jessica Fanzo of Johns Hopkins. She was your lecturer for the week. And joining her is Will Masters, who's a professor at Tufts University. We'll hear his lectures a little bit later in this course in week 6, but glad that you could join us today. Maybe I'll start with brief introductions from Will and then Jess, or vice versa. We'll say Will and then Jess. Thanks.
All right. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Lauren for organizing. And I think the TA for the class, Helen Prince, has also been super helpful to everyone in the class, including me as an instructor. So I teach at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm an economist by training, but I've worked on food and nutrition my whole career. I actually started with field work in Zimbabwe, doing 2 years of farm household surveys in the late 1980s, and then worked on grain markets and new technology adoption, productivity, international trade, and was more and more interested in nutrition. So for the last 8 years, I've been in a school of nutrition, which is focused primarily on health outcomes. So that's what we'll be talking about this week. And right now, that's what you've been talking about this week, and we'll talk about for this hour.
Great. My name is Jess Fanzo. Thank you all for being here. And I hope you are enjoying Module 3 of what I think is a fantastic online course. I am a professor at Johns Hopkins University. I sit in a couple of schools, the International Affairs School, the School of Public Health, and the Berman Institute of Bioethics. I focus on diets, looking at sustainability issues, but also health and livelihood issues at the intersection of diets, nutrition, agriculture, and the environment. And it's a pleasure to be here with Professor Masters.
Yeah, Professor Fanzo. So I've been able to just watch sort of slack-jawed as the EAT Foundation has organized this Eat Lancet Commission on a diet that would fit within planetary boundaries and meet both health and environmental goals at the same time. In my own life, I find it hard enough to meet one goal at a time. And they set themselves this very ambitious agenda to identify a healthy diet, and roped you in to be a commissioner in this Eat Lancet Commission. And as I think many participants, if not all participants on the call and participants in the course have seen, there's been a tremendous amount of energy and excitement around the Lancet Commission that you were a part of, and the commission report that just came out. And I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's my principle. I'm on the phone with Jess, got to ask her about the Lancet Commission. Kind of who was involved in this? Why was it formed? And what was your role in the commission?
Yeah, so for those of you who have never read the Lancet is a peer-reviewed journal. It's a medical journal out of England, and it really focuses on the health sector and the health system. But more and more, they've been doing work on other issues that relate to health, the food system, the environment system, climate change. And they have a particular focus this year. They call it the Year of Nutrition. They're publishing several reports and articles and series of articles on nutrition. And the Lancet every year does these longer commission reports. They're too long. They're 45 to 50 pages long. They're very dense. And they coalesce around a specific topic. So you'll see a commission on surgery. You'll see a commission on climate change and health. You'll see a commission on tuberculosis. So they range widely. And this commission was really trying to answer the question of, can we eat, we being the world, a healthy diet for ourselves, for human health, and the planet? Is it possible to feed the world by 2050 and save ourselves and save the Mother Earth? That was really the big question. Can we do it? And so the commission was 37 commissioners and co-authors being many younger people, some postdoctoral fellows, students like yourself who were part of this group to answer that question. And EAT, you often hear the term EAT, Lancet Commission. EAT is a group that hosted the commission report and pulled together the commissioners in a facilitation role. The commission report was made up of many different experts and people focusing in different disciplines, from environment, climate, health, nutrition, ecology, economics. So it brought together a multi-disciplinary team to really try to answer this question. I sat, and we had people from different countries, of course, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from North America, from Europe, all on this panel. Middle East, with bringing in different types of experts. I sat mainly looking at the trade-offs piece. So there was different groups. So we all got into different working groups. You had the group that focused on the diet piece, which I can talk about a little bit, the environment target group. And then there was a group on, okay, so you've got diets and environment targets. What would the world look like in 2050, and how would we meet those targets? And then we had a policy group of what would be the implications on a policy side. And I sat on that group that was looking really at those trade-offs and what are we going to do in 2050.
Yeah, it's an amazingly ambitious agenda, but a sort of clever design for a project and an extraordinary audience to reach the Lancets. Lancet has a tremendous sort of publicity machine and a great audience that they can reach. And I'm wondering if you can just summarize like the main conclusions, right? So in particular, is it possible to reach these multiple objectives with one diet, with one approach to agriculture, or are these things fundamentally impossible to do?
Yeah. So what were the big outcomes of this? The first was it was setting up targets for healthy diets and the environmental limits or earth systems. And anytime you start to set up targets, you create positives and negatives. You set a bar which people can try to then reach. The negatives is that you start to put numbers to things and it gets quite controversial. And so this report was global in scope. It didn't get very specific into the regional or local type of recommendation. So is very lofty global report. And it did really two things. It set out what is a healthy reference diet. And it did that independent of the planet. So what would it mean for people to achieve a healthy diet and live a long life? And that was set out. And that is a very controversial piece that maybe we can talk about a little bit later, in that diet, looking at cardiovascular disease risk and other disease outcomes, is very low in meat, particularly red and processed meat. And it's very rich in plant-based foods and other protein sources. So very high in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, monounsaturated oils like olive oil, and lower consumption of animal source foods. And you can quickly get into a debate about, well, animal source foods are really important for children, particularly for growth and development. And this diet was looking at ages 2 and older, excluding that under 2 population, which animal source foods are critically important for meeting nutrient needs like zinc and iron and protein and all other kinds of really healthy nutrients. And we know that much of the world doesn't get enough of those animal source foods for growth and development. But what that group found in the commission was that there are some populations that are just consuming way too much red meat, way too much processed meat, and other parts of the world are not getting enough. So there needs to be an equity balance here, right? So in the United States, we consume red meat. Sometimes Americans will consume it at every meal, and it's just not necessary for human health. So they pulled together data from randomized control trials, cohort observational studies, and came up with this reference diet. And it's very controversial. Like livestock industry, for example, was not really pleased with that recommendation of reducing livestock product consumption. Another group pulled together 6 targets around the environment. They were greenhouse gas emissions, land use, biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as water, and setting boundaries of what we do not want to go beyond. Then the other group came together and said, okay, so we've got this healthy reference diet, and we have these 6 environmental targets. What can we do? And they modeled this out and looked at what food production systems would look like in the future, and can it be done? And it's argued that it can be done when we look at different environmental targets, but it has to be a package of things. If everyone in the world consumed the healthy reference planet diet, we would significantly reduce greenhouse gases, but we wouldn't make a huge impact on the water footprint, on land use, on biodiversity loss. We need other things. Those other things are things like reducing food loss and waste, and improving production practices on farms. And if we really want to see disease come down, mortality come down from diets, and we want to see the planet protected across these suite of environmental indicators, we need this multi-prong, multi-actor, multi-sector approach. So consumers would need to shift diets, particularly in some places where too much meat is consumed. We need better food production practices, better technologies that are available now. And we need to significantly reduce food loss and waste. And we call for these 5 actions, these transformations that need to happen across the food system. Diet is one piece of that. And it's not going to be all on the shoulders of consumers. We need governments to govern, to help consumers make better choices or more sustainable, healthy choices. It's not going to be just leaving it up to the consumer to figure all this out. But another suite of transformations that need to take place across lands, across oceans, etc. And I would say that it's going to look different in every place. And what this commission report did, and all of its controversy, is it created the debate. It set it out, it published it, and now it's time to debate it and see what it would look like in the city of New York versus the city of Nairobi versus rural Rwanda. You know, what would this sustainable diets and food systems look like across the planet, taking into account local context, local actors, local priorities? So in a nutshell, it can be done with technologies and evidence that we have in hand now, but it's going to be a significant shift in behaviors, not just consumer behavior, but producer behavior, government behavior, private sector actor behavior. Has to be all hands on deck if we really want to take it seriously around the climate change agenda and the human health agenda.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a remarkable outcome, really. You know, what struck me most in the way you've told it now and in other things I've seen is the way that the outcome ended up focusing so squarely on the red meat and processed meat question, and response to Eat Lancet is also focused on that, as opposed to, for example, food processing and the issue of whether refined grains and added sugar and so forth are the central issue in health. And then in agriculture, the question of whether local varieties and agroecological remedies, as opposed to crop breeding and genetic innovation. So it seemed like the outcome kind of sidestepped those other debates and ended up focusing squarely on the meat question, and running into this this tremendous resistance from both the meat industry, producers, and also the kind of cultural significance of meat, as well as the nutrition community that advocates for more meat in the diet for reducing carbohydrate intake and diabetes risk. So I'm really curious, from your point of view, when you look back, okay, so it came out squarely focused on vegetal foods as opposed to red meat and processed meat, and then other animal source foods as well. And I'm curious if you can sort of trace back the origins of who was involved in Eat Lancet, and how it was funded, who was involved, and to what degree did that influence this outcome? The outcome of focusing on meat as opposed to processing or agricultural technology.
It's a great question. I mean, there was lots of things left out of the report. The whole, Will, your bread and butter economics was completely left out, right? Women, I don't even know if women was mentioned once in the report. Processed packaged foods was not mentioned. The sugar was recommended at the WHO level of what they recommend. But there was a real misconception that this report was advocating for high carb diets, which has been assumed to be a contributor to the obesity pandemic that we see in the world now. Obviously, there's a nuance to that, and it was really trying to promote whole grains, which most of the world does not consume either. They consume very processed, staple carbohydrates and high sugar diets. And obviously the red meat issue is a big one. Culturally, for some cultures, red meat's really important. And we know also it can be an important nutritional component of diets when consumed in certain amounts. So, stepping back, I think there was a lot of things the commission report could have done better. But when you sit on a commission as a scientist, you have to work together and you have to make certain concessions. And so, we had some real giants on the commission report, like David Tillman, who's one of the world's most cited ecologists. Did he agree with everything in the report? Maybe not, but we all had to make some compromises. Now, the two co-chairs of the commission are very strong scientists, and they're quite well known. One is Walter Willett, who's a nutrition epidemiologist at Harvard University, and he really led the diet piece. And you had Johan Rockström, who was formerly at the Stockholm Resilience Center, who leads a lot of work on something called planetary boundaries. Now, both of their approaches are not totally agreed on by their communities that they sit in. They have their own views. I think maybe when you get to be very senior, you maybe become a little bit ideological about your science. Will and I don't, but everybody else does. Just kidding. And I think they have a certain approach and a view of the way they see the world through the evidence lens that they take. And what's really interesting, Will, and to all those listening, is that, the healthy reference diet was the most controversial, and what you saw on social media and what you saw in printed press. That was the most contentious issue. But the environment targets were equally radical, but didn't get as much controversy around them. And what I thought was interesting and what it showed is how controversial the nutrition science community is and fractured it can be. It really shows that And I would say it's really around three things. One is Walter Willett and the team, the commission that was working on that diet, take a certain view, a certain look at science. And there are those in the nutrition world who don't agree with that approach. And the kind of studies that were used to make that healthy reference diet. And I think, so there was a controversy in the science community around the kind of data that was used. So I think that was one controversy. The second controversy was around the meat, the reducing meat, and the impacts of that on the livestock sector, that the impacts of that for low-income places, pastoralist communities, other kind of animal production systems, and what's the best kind of sustainable system that would answer to the meat issue. And I think the third was very much a consumer controversy around what's called the paleo diet, the Paleolithic caveman diet that many follow in the world, which is a very meat-heavy diet and low carb. And you would see a lot of things on Twitter saying, I've never felt better than as I do now, because I eat a very high meat diet. I've never felt better. I feel the best I've ever felt. So why is the Eat Lancet recommending this low meat diet when I have this paleo diet that makes me feel so good? To me, you've missed the point of the report. It's not about you anymore. What you eat has implications in your household, in your community, and in the world. We are in a globalized, very connected food system. The I doesn't matter so much anymore. Yes, of course, your individual health does matter, but you also have to be thinking about the implications of your diet choices for the world, because we are living in a very dense, connected world now. So when I was seeing the I stuff, it bothered me a bit, because I think they missed the message that we're in this together. We need to make some transformations. We're on an unsustainable path. Climate change is barreling down on us, and we are running out of time. We need to take actions across many things, and diet is going to be one of them. Less transatlantic flights, maybe having 2 children instead of 3 children. All of these things are going to matter for us. And we need to be thinking about us as global citizens working together in this. The other big controversial piece was EAT and where they get their money from. EAT was started by Gunhild Stortalen. She is Norwegian. She is incredibly wealthy. She did not fund the commission, and you'll see a lot of that. There's this misconception that it was Gunhild Stortalen's funding. It wasn't. It was funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is a foundation in the UK, much like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the commission was written by independent international researchers, published after an external peer review in the Lancet. And there was really no funding coming from EAT itself. EAT was acting as just to bring everybody together, and they
So Jess, I've just lost your sound. I don't know if others can hear
so
me.
that other kind of.
You're back. Good.
Good.
So
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
we lost your sound for just a segment, but let me ask this. So when you are talking about the response so far, there's been a lot of professional media, a lot of social media. You talked especially about people defending their own diets and their right to eat the way they want, as well as the industry seeing it as an attack on them. I'm curious about the kind of the way forward into influence on policymaking circles, on business practices, sort of major corporations in the food system. How do you see this playing out? Is this mostly a big media splash, Or how will this proceed? What do you forecast for the next year?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, what it sets out is some scientific targets that then would need to become robust science-based targets, and they could inform global agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals, right? In which countries make plans towards those goals and prioritize specific goals. I think it calls for governments to govern and think about their food systems and the connections of what's produced in their country, what their citizens are eating around a sustainability agenda in climate. I think it calls for the private sector, food and beverage industry, which is a big, massive thing made up of many different types of sizes and shapes and influence. I think it calls for them to think about the two married pieces, the health and the environment piece. You know, I think a lot of private sector is rallying around environmental indicators because they're very much worried about their bottom line, their profit in the future of running out of natural resources to make the commodities that keep their businesses thriving. I think more and more now, it's a call for private sector to think about health at the same time. Do they want a consumer base in 2050 that is living a long life so they can continue to buy their products into old age, right? This is potentially a business win for them if they're thinking about the health and environment together. So I think it really calls for different groups to start caring about this agenda, governments to start governing their food systems, private sector to integrate health and sustainability into their profit margins. So, and for consumers, particularly those in high income countries, to be thinking about what they're eating, and for their own health, but for the health of their community that they live in, and really, it's one individual change that you could potentially do in mitigating this big thing called climate change that's going to significantly affect all of our lives and already is.
But I think I'm hearing a little bit of optimism in your voice. You're describing a pretty big challenge, but something that seems feasible to you. Would you say that 10 years from now we'll look back and say we're on track for a healthier 2050?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential in agriculture and food systems to shift. You know, I see a question popping up right now about moringa as a superfood. I think there are a lot of these sort of forgotten foods and indigenous foods that have great potential that could be important in production systems, and filling nutrient gaps, filling interesting cost gaps. So I think I see a lot of potential, but I think it's going to mean that people need to take the climate change agenda seriously and be thinking about the interlinkages of human health and planet health. You know, I think there's a few countries who have not signed up to the COP, including the country that you and I live in, Will. And I think that's a big step back. And I think it's really concerning. And I think this brings in the politics of the world right now. And you know, are we in better times or not? I don't know. It's the politics of the world complicate all the work that we do in nutrition. So I'm optimistic for the future, and I think the millennials and the younger generation are the one who is more worried about this than our generation will. I think they're deeply concerned about their future, and I think they will be the ones to make the transformative change that we started to think about, but I think they'll do it in a more radical way.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. Yeah. So the question that you just referred to comes from Salman Ayub, who asked about moringa in particular. as a food that's been often called, sort of a superfood, because of its very high level of nutrient density, and playing a sort of ecological niche, Jess, as you were just saying. I think it is worth kind of pausing for a minute and asking, why is it that the world food system came to concentrate so heavily on white, on rice, wheat, maize, and then how soybean emerged as the blockbuster source of protein and oil, and then canola or rapeseed emerged as another oil, and other oils kind of have come along in various ways. And then in the animal kingdom, we've ended up so dependent on ruminant cattle. And there's an image of a goat. The small ruminant has given way to the large ruminant, and then, of course, pigs and chickens playing a big role in the animal kingdom as well. Why did we go from such a diverse agricultural base when agriculture was first developed 10,000 or more years ago, to such a small number of species today? What's your view on that? Why did we concentrate so much of our food source on those few species?
I mean, I think you know this much more than I do, Will, and I'd like to hear your answer. But, I think agriculture research focused on these few crop commodities and really tried to make them as high yielding and efficient as possible. And following that with the Green Revolution in mainly that impacted Asia and Latin America, less so in Africa, kind of fueled those key crops.
Yeah, no, it's very true.
The homogeneous, so.
Although a lot of the crop breeding happened actually earlier. So we've lost you.
I mean, so that here research funds and development goes towards those few crops, but why is that? How did that start?
Right. So we just lost your audio for a minute, but I would say it's notable in a lot of evidence that the concentration on those few species began much, much earlier, actually, than modern crop breeding, as individual farmers were doing what we now call mass selection, meaning that the whole dispersed community of farmers across a very large area was each individual person selecting the best seed and retaining and sharing the best seed among neighbors. So you had this mass selection process of individual, and that really, led to the development of modern maize in the first place, even before scientific breeding. So there was, a sort of extraordinary quality of maize, which has this plasticity, as we call it, tall, short, early, late, every color of the rainbow. And then wheat and rice have different kinds of adaptability, even before crop breeding. So I think it's a huge challenge to see if we can turn a scientific eye to moringa and make it as productive as it can be as a species. Because currently when people are planting and harvesting moringa, they're harvesting something that has not benefited from those thousands of years, literally thousands of years. And then, of course, a couple of hundred years of kind of modern science. So it's possible that we could actually do miracles of science in uncovering things that have been neglected and bringing them into agricultural systems in a productive way. Currently, something like moringa has just such low yields that even though it's a superfood when you get it, we have very little of it in our food supply.
And there's a great report that just came out today, actually, called Future 50 Foods, 50 Foods for a Healthier Planet and a Healthier People by World Wildlife Fund. And it talks about some of these more neglected crops like quinoa and moringa and amaranth that Salman might be interested in looking at.
Yep. Very, very interesting. Yeah. And I am optimistic about the potential for um, science to work much faster now. And we do see that where with modern genetic techniques, we're able to draw on biodiversity from all around the world much, much faster, and bring in the best of every agroecosystem, to confer resilience. The big story is resilience against these high temperatures, for which we need genetic material from places that have been very high temperature. If the soil is 40, 42 degrees centigrade, you're baking the seed, and it's very hard to have high productivity, at the high temperatures, the moisture stress, as well as all the disease stresses. So environments that are affected by fall armyworm over the last couple of years, drawing on genetic diversity, and a lot of that's, of course, within a species, but then outside species. So as you're saying, amaranth, moringa, many leguminous grains as well. Big challenge to get
and
those.
Francis talks, asking a question about these laboratory created meats or lab grown meats. And so this is a whole other space around the future of foods and all the technology that's coming online with like these lab grown meats, or what they call finless foods, which are fish grown from stem cells. All these protein alternatives, plant-based protein alternatives that look like meat, smell like meat, taste like meat, but they're not meat. All of these kind of future technologies could be potential game changers too, but we know that there's the whole insect space, but we have to still get over these issues around consumer fear, or cultural issues around these kind of things, ethical issues around lab grown meats, and what does that mean for livestock systems. Some argue that animals are critical for food systems and the planet and the whole ecosystem. So I think Francis asks a great question, but it could be really important in the whole landscape of this future technologies of completely taking the animal out of the system. And what is that going to look like? And is it going to be accepted by consumers?
Yeah. And an interesting difference between the lab-grown, quote, cellular meat, like the finless fish, or the a company in the United States called Memphis Meats. There's other ones in the Netherlands and elsewhere, where they're making bioreactors that are using some kind of photosynthesis or something, using yeast or cellular agriculture with no, versus the plant-based, which are already available, which I sort of describe as making a better falafel, a better fritter, a fried product that's just a little bit more meat-like than our existing legume-based fried food. So you get your and if those do succeed, they could play a big role. But the amounts of capital required to build those facilities, and the amount of energy you have to put into them in terms of electricity, is the fundamental limiting factor, right? Where the great thing about agriculture, including livestock, is the natural photosynthesis on the existing land, and the animal providing her own motive power across the field to graze and harvest the photosynthesis, and then and replacing that as lab-grown meat or plant-based meat is requires a lot of capital. So it's something you do in very rich places that have that. Some really interesting other questions have come in. Irina Margold asks, what do we think of true cost of food policies. So are farmers paying what it costs to grow the different foods? Is that something that the Eat Lancet Commission explicitly addressed?
No, or will consumers pay, right? Do you tax foods that are high carbon emitting type foods? And we don't really go into that. There's a little bit of economics in the end, but tax was not really addressed at all. Like, should there be a tax? But one of the commissioners, Marco Springman at Oxford, he did some modeling around taxing high carbon foods, and found that it could potentially decrease he links it to mortality. He does some modeling, links it to mortality, and that the tax would actually save lives. But you quickly get into ethical issues around taxing something that could be healthy for certain populations. And maybe, Will, you could talk a little bit about the regressivity of certain taxes, comparing maybe soda tax to a red meat tax could be a different sort of scenario would play out.
Yeah, no, I think it's super important. It's a great question. And, I'd begin by saying governments have a number of different tools to move society towards an outcome that we prefer. And one, is using taxes to change incentives to make people pay for what economists call an externality, meaning something that harms someone else that they haven't bought and sold with you. You just are a bystander. And when I buy the meat, it causes climate change, and that harms children and grandchildren and so forth. But others are direct regulation, where the government would simply say you have to stop at the stop sign. When you build a house, you have to build it this way. And when you sell your foods, you have to do this certain thing. Direct investments by governments, when governments do things directly, like research. So between the direct investments, the regulations, and the taxes, it's clear that there's some element of every one of those three parts of the toolkit. A lot of direct investment is really crucial for improving technology and things that we want for the future, because without that, we'd never get the new technology. The regulation is often much more powerful than a tax. So direct regulation of the livestock industry is how we have gotten reduced antibiotic use to the extent that we've gotten that, and other improvements. And then taxes are often a last resort because they don't work that well. Taxes don't work that well, in part because it's hard to get them approved by legislatures because they're so visible. They don't work that well, in part because they're really hard often to enforce and actually implement. So I can model a tax that I might not be able to implement in practice, either because the legislature would not pass it or because I couldn't actually do it in the real world. I would have a pretend tax, right, that the government might pass but not be able to enforce. And finally, you end up with that small category of taxes that you can actually pass, that you can actually implement, and that would really influence the world. And then I would just flag two categories of those where you're, as the person asked, you're sort of capturing a true cost. One is trying to tax something that a producer would use or do so as to change the mix of inputs, right? So you could have a water use tax. And as everyone, I hope, is aware, the world is running out of free water. We're not running out of water in general, but to get to water use in equilibrium with planetary boundaries, we need to sharply reduce the free water use and bring water into, and so charging for water is a big part of, and then charging for pollution potentially, so that farmers don't have as much runoff, to the extent that that's possible, with taxation of fertilizer, for example. And you get at what Jess described as the whether it's something is regressive or progressive, especially on the consumer-oriented taxes, where your goal is to change consumer behavior to make people do something that they don't want to do in the short run, but would be good for them in the longer run, like, for example, eating less processed and red meat. So there, you end up with many taxes that fall particularly on poorer people, and we call that regressive because it brings income distribution backwards in a direction we don't want. So it's regressive in that sense, versus a tax that's progressive, meaning that the richer people pay a larger share. And so something like a soda tax is very controversial in large part because it is so regressive, because poorer people in richer countries tend to spend more of their income on the sugar sweetened beverages. So a soda tax hits the poor hardest. And when you have a situation like that, you just have to make sure you spend the money on those people. And so the cities and governments that have been successful in introducing taxes which might be regressive, make sure they give the money back to that community, either as a direct rebate. So the central proposal in the United States now for a carbon tax, meaning directly taxing carbon, when it comes out of the ground in fossil fuels, you make people pay some to the government to offset climate change, in addition to the market price. So that raises the price of everything in proportion to how much carbon it's got in it. The current proposal for carbon tax is a carbon dividend. So that tax would raise trillions of dollars, and it would be directly rebated back to Americans in that same year, with the same amount received by every American. So the carbon dividend proposal that has just received more signatories from economists than any petition among economists ever. So there's unprecedented unanimity among economists that we should be taxing carbon when it comes out of the ground, so that everything is more expensive in proportion to how much carbon it has in it, but then give that money right back in equal amounts to every person, is one way you address regressivity. And one could do something like that with meat, for example, or other harmful things. So there have been several other questions. Jess, do you want to pull from that?
Well, one was the early question was around what kind of approach could result in a decrease in meat consumption in countries where out of tradition people eat lots of meat. People feel strongly about traditions. I think that's a great question. From Marin Vorhar. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that quite right. I think that is a great question. And you really get into consumer behavior and traditions and culture. And obviously, you want people to hold on to their traditions and the culture of food and how that revolves around their life and their families and their friends and religion, etc. But, I think behavior is malleable. People shift. People do change their diets. You often hear consumers don't really change, but they do, and they can change quite quickly depending on what triggers them to make those changes, whether it's price or lifestyle or taste. In the United States, we can think of something like the gluten-free shift in people not wanting to consume gluten because they think it's healthier. And that has completely reshaped supply, from restaurants having gluten-free products to the grain of wheat being cultivated is changing. And people shifted quite quickly. They went from consuming something that was a macro ingredient of their diets to really avoiding it at all costs in wheat. Skim milk changes in the United States from whole milk to skim milk, and actually the taste buds change, where a lot of people can't consume whole milk now. They find it too creamy, which was something that was very important and traditional in the American diet, is milk. So I think people can shift if they choose to. I think some people also shift because of health. We saw a decline in red meat consumption in the United States in the 1980s when they started to link it to cardiovascular disease. And it really scared people when they would go to their doctor and they were at risk for heart disease or having a heart attack. And doctors were recommending for them to shift away from certain products, and one of those being red meat. And we did see a flattening out of red meat consumption, particularly around middle-aged men who are at risk for heart disease. So I think there's also the fear of mortality sometimes that scares people into changing their diets, even when they're traditionally important in their lives. So I think, it can happen, not all the time, but you do see people move away from their traditional cuisines for the better and for the worse. Richard Williams asked a question around consumers, or no, I'm sorry, it was Peter Mitchell asks around companies like Whole Foods, which is a upend market supermarket in the United States. I'm not sure if it's in Europe. Has it assisted with consumer demand for healthy foods? Is their success enough to change the trajectory as other companies copy them? I don't really know the question, the answer to that question. It's a good one. I think Whole Foods is it's a market that only the elite can really shop at. It's a very expensive market. Some people call it whole paycheck, because you spend your entire paycheck when you walk into Whole Foods. So I think, I don't know Whole Foods' impact on consumer demand for healthy foods. It has a big impact in DC. There's Whole Foods everywhere now. But that, again, is a wealthier segment of society living in DC. I don't know, Will, if you know the answer to that, the types of supermarkets, and do they make an impact on people shifting towards different types of diets?
Yeah, I think there's, a fair amount of evidence on this in the United States. I think one big important concern would be that the advertising that's done at a place like Whole Foods markets, as Jess was saying, for the elite, markets a certain notion of healthiness, which is not exactly what the Lancet Commission recommends, and is not what nutritionists recommend. And it often says, what's healthiest is a set of attributes that we are selling to you. And that leads to people thinking that a healthy diet is an expensive diet. And I think one really interesting thing about the Lancet report is that that's not necessarily the case, actually. What's happened in the United States in response to the question of whether Whole Foods and the definitions of healthy have changed diets as other companies have copied them, is absolutely they have. What we've seen is lower end markets using more mass marketing, lower cost techniques have really changed what they do. So the largest buyer of fruits and vegetables, very high nutritious foods in the United States is Walmart at the very lowest price levels, so that in many settings, low-income people can now buy fruits and vegetables at far lower prices than they could in the past, especially in the winter. And so I think that transformation is well underway. And the concern is that companies like Whole Foods that market to the high end will define healthy in ways that are expensive. When in fact, if public health messaging can successfully, like the Lancet report, say it doesn't have to be fresh fruits, it can be frozen fruits and vegetables. It doesn't have to be, very fancy things. It can be very simple ones.
Yeah.
And Jess, there's one other question an aspect of questions, somebody talking about the tradition of meat eating and the question of how hard it is to address societies for whom meat is a really important part of festivals, has religious significance, and so forth. These are very old traditions. What do you think about the quantities involved, right? So it's, if one is, so it turns out, right, in sort of Islamic communities, other communities that have very important role for meat consumption, the total quantities over the course of the year aren't very large, right?
Yeah.
In contrast, many meat eating societies that don't think of themselves as really all that meat oriented eat huge amounts of it, kind of on autopilot, right? Do you see, Eat Lancet was not anti-meat at all, right? The quantities are not zero. Can you say a little bit about the quantities involved and how they relate to traditional use of meat when meat was scarce?
And the Lancet gave a range, right? It wasn't just, it is low, but it took into account a larger range depending on where you are and what kind of meat you consume. And it wasn't just, it was looking at pork, poultry, eggs. If you take it all together, it gives a range. Yeah, I don't really know as far as, I think people don't, maybe I'm kind of skirting your question, Will, but I think people don't really know how much meat they eat. I think if people really were conscious of it, they'd realize, and even for myself, speaking of someone who's a nutritionist, I tried to do something where I'm not a vegetarian and I'm not a vegan. I do eat meat. I'm Italian American and I like my meatballs. But I tried to do something where I was a vegetarian by day and then I'd eat meat at night. So I was just trying to see what would it be like to eat and even trying to be a vegan. And I realized everywhere I went, how hard it is to be vegetarian in some societies. In Indian societies, it's much easier. In Ethiopian societies, it's much easier. But in America and Europe, it's incredibly hard to seek out vegetarian, tasty options. And you realize how much you consume animal source foods at every meal. I was recently in Spain and I ordered a grilled fish. And on top of when they brought it out, on top of the fish was ham. It was jamon, which is very popular in Spanish culture and very traditional. It's very important for them from a cultural perspective. But it becomes really hard to avoid it in the country. So I think and I'm not talking about, your question really, Will, but just I want all of you to just really pay attention to your diet and see how much you get of meat every day, and even how much vegetables do you consume every day. There's been days where I don't eat any vegetables, and I realize that at the end of the day that I didn't have any leafy greens or, if you start to kind of watch your own diet, you realize the inefficiencies and deficiencies in it, or that, you consume too much of something. But, the whole idea of a good quality diet is one of variety and, you're getting a lot of color on your plate and it's mixed. It's a mixing of food groups and, but yeah, I think, Americans particularly are not conscious of the just vast amounts of meat that they eat at every meal: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks.
Yeah. And the same is true for sugar or other potentially harmful parts of the diet. And so much of what we're seeing in nutrition science and shown in the Eat Lancet Commission is just the power of, for the first time, becoming aware of that. So, if there's kind of one take-home message that I bring, for myself from what you just said, it's just the power of paying attention. That when when we do surveys of what people eat, they just leave things off, not because they're embarrassed, but because you don't remember. I personally don't remember what I because so much of eating is unconscious, and making it conscious and being guided is a big part of it. So Jess, are there other takeaways you'd want to flag for people to?
I mean, I think there's a great article today that came out called More Than a Diet in the Lancet Planetary Health. And they talk about this commission along with another commission, the Syndemic of Obesity, Undernutrition, and Climate Change, which was released about a week later. Very similar messages that we need to be thinking about human health and planet health. But in this short article, this More Than a Diet article, it was really interesting. They say perhaps the main reason nutrition has thrust planetary health into public consciousness is the role of food and culture. Food is essential to life and diet, and culture form the very fabric of life. And I think that really gets at the controversy and the passion that was brought to this debate, is that when you start to talk about food, you talk about culture, and it becomes very personal. And we all have to think about, then you're asking people, well, what do you eat every day? And how is it impacting your health? But how is it impacting the world? And, food, which is so personal, and we're all experts at it because we eat every day, all of a sudden is thrust into something bigger. And it makes us question things about our own choices and the culture and traditions that we live by. So to me, it raises a lot of interesting questions that we ourselves can ask, but are also our role in this great human endeavor called life that we share this planet, right? So I think it's a really important time. You as students, taking this course, you're thinking about food and all of its facets. And to me, it's a wonderful time to be a part of the debate and the conversation, not only as scientists or as practitioners or policymakers, but as consumers and citizens. So I think it's a great time to reflect on what we eat, why we make certain decisions, and can we make better decisions not only for our own health, but for the planet?
Thank you. Those are great questions, great words of wisdom, really helpful. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Enjoy the rest of the course too. I'll see you in week 6. It's been great so far. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.